Yes, hello to you all out there again, and welcome back to the latest episode of Classic Dirt Bike TV here on YouTube, where we rediscover some of those old vintage race bikes from way back in the day. Now, normally here on Classic Dirt Bike TV, we feature old dirt bikes from the 1950s and sometimes right up until about the mid 1990s, and in between times we've been known to feature quite rare and obscure dirt bikes in between. So if these are the kind of machines that you like to look at here on YouTube, then I do hope you will consider subscribing to my channel, and that way in the future you won't miss out on any of my future video postings. So coming up next, we're going to go back to the 1960s and take a look at another old timer, and this particular bike here certainly has some history behind it because it was ridden by one of those old Scrambles legends from that particular period. So without any further delay, let's jump straight into the video and take a look at Bryan Badger Goss' twin shock Greeves. Now, this bike here was a very nice Greeves Challenger that I spotted while I was at the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show just recently, and this machine here belonged at one time to the late and great Bryan Badger Goss, who, as you know, was one of the UK's top scrambling stars of the 1960s and 70s. Now, Bryan Goss, or Bryan Winston Goss to give him his full name, started off-road racing when he was just 16 years old, when he rode at that time a 197cc LCS, or a Lou Coffin Special. Now, sometime later in the 1960s, he secured a factory bike and then rode for Cotton for the following 3 years until eventually he was signed up to ride for Greeves in 1963 and 1964. Now, Bryan went on to win the British Championship in 1970, as well as winning many other Scrambles victories in the UK and in Europe. And I'm sure if you're of a certain age, you'll remember those UK winters when the likes of Bryan Goss, Vicky Swood, Alan Clough, Dave Bickers, and the brothers of Don and Derek Rickman, whose race events were all broadcast live on the BBC Grandstand sports programme, where we could watch all of those aforementioned sports stars battering around a very muddy racetrack on these old BSAs, Greeves and HISs. But it was highly entertaining and quite influential watching all that motorcycle action as a young kid. Now, some of Bryan's other successes were that he won both legs of the Trophy des Nations at Brands Hatch in 1966, which is now, of course, titled the Motocross des Nations. And at that time, Bryan beat the great Joel Robert, Torsten Hollmann, and, of course, Bryan's teammate at the time, the great Dave Bickers. Although naturally I can't tell Bryan's life story and list all of his race wins and successes in this very short video, but it certainly goes without saying that he was up there with those other British Scrambles legends of their time, including Vicky Swood and Dave Bickers and many others who put British Scrambles on the world map. Now, beginning with the bike's chassis, which is stamped 24 MDS 146, as you can see here near the headstock, which I'm sure that all of you Greeves fans out there will already be flicking through your Greeves frame identification logs just to try and work out its actual year of manufacture, but I do have it on quite good authority that this is a 1961 chassis. Now, the frame mainly consists of light steel tubing, and many of these early Greeves racers used this I-beam alloy front frame down tube, with the bike's motor also used as a stressed member to connect the alloy downspar to the rear of that steel part of the chassis. Although it just goes to show that even in 1961, these British Greeves bikes were already using alloy frames in their Scrambles bikes construction, which of course were years ahead of the big Japanese companies like Honda or Yamaha. And once again, the bike's rear swing arm was a simple box section steel affair, but one of the very interesting points about this swing arm is that it also housed an early type of chain lubrication system, and that little tube that you can see there sticking up on the top of the swing arm was actually a small oil tank that held the oil, which then flowed down inside the left side of the swing arm, and then it dripped out onto the chain. And this little vertical tube type dispenser then fed the oil onto the chain rollers. But when you think of it, this is a brilliant idea, and not unlike those modern systems that you can buy in the shops now that basically do exactly the same job. And so as we move on to the bike's front end, now these old Greeves Challengers had these leading link type front suspensions, which as I remember gave the rider about, I think it was between 4 and 6 inches of travel at the front end. Now these fork suspension units were fitted inside the fork tubes, and for 1961 these were very basic dampers, and they never really helped in keeping the front end of the bike in check on very bumpy racetracks. But riders of these machines in the early 1960s were pretty tough guys, and they certainly coped well with this basic technology of its day. But once again, old school drum brakes, which were your motorcycle brakes of their time, and almost every single type and configuration of motorcycle in that period all used variations on these old style drum brake systems. But that's not to say that they were bad, it's just maybe not as good as our modern day hydraulic motorcycle braking systems. Now, if my aging memory is still intact, I'm pretty sure that these old Challengers would have come from the Greeves factory with a pair of girdling dampers on the back of the bike, and because these are naturally no longer available for these old timers, then a pair of period correct classic Hagen shocks have now been bolted in their place. But again, the older girdlings of their time weren't exactly high-tech pieces of equipment, but for 1961 those were what those guys had to work with back in the day. And if you've ever witnessed some of these old Greeves bikes racing on the track, then you may have noticed that they did do a bit of bouncing around at the rear, although again it never seemed to worry the likes of Bryan Goss and the rest of those scrambling stars of their time. They just held that throttle wide open and just got on with the job in hand. And so as we now move on to the bike's power plant, now I never actually found out on the day that I took these video clips of the bike if this was actually a 250 or a 360 motor, but of course, as you can see, it is a Villiers two-stroke engine, because at this time Villiers were still supplying engines to Greeves for their motorcycles, although it wouldn't be too long before Greeves began designing and then building their own engines to power their Scrambles race bikes. Now, once more, the fuel to feed that Villiers engine was supplied through this Amal monoblock carburetor, which is a carburetor that served many British motorcycles well through the 1960s and 1970s, and these old monoblocks were fitted to a wide range of British motorcycles back in the day. And again, as I recall, it was an old school type paper filter that was housed inside this air filter housing, which when contaminated you either just cleaned it with compressed air or then just binned it and fitted a brand new item instead. Now, as we move on to the exhaust pipe on that Villiers motor, now this was just a very simple big bore straight through pipe that exited just underneath the motor. Now, I'm pretty sure that the reason why Greeves never ever fitted a tailpipe on these Scramblers was purely just to save weight on what was already a quite light and powerful race bike, but I expect it still sounded great when that two-stroke Villiers engine fired into life. Now, the footrests again were another example of how simple the frame's construction was on these Greeves, with just these bits of rolled steel bar to act as footrests, which must have been quite slippy to try and keep your feet on when it was wet and muddy. Now, for me personally, one of the things that I think makes a good old classic dirt bike is plenty of alloy, which, as you know, was the material of choice long ago for these off-road bikes, as plastic was still a few years away, and these alloy fuel tanks here are the bread and butter of what makes a good classic Scrambler. And our Greeves tank here also has one of those old school Monza style fuel caps. Although I'm certainly young enough still to remember when almost all Scrambles bikes were fitted with alloy mudguards on the front and at the back of the bike, and okay, they weren't as durable as plastic, and if you did bend them then you could maybe get away with straightening them a few times and then eventually they would just break, but they still had a great look, which was much better than those coloured plastic ones that we have in this modern day. But I must say, you've got to have a certain amount of sympathy with the likes of Bryan Goss and the rest of his fellow racers back then, because they had to contend with very little in the way of suspension travel, and to crown it all, these rock hard seats never really helped to soften the blow either. And that's why when you look at some of that old footage of these guys racing on these old bikes, almost all of them you could see wore kidney belts around their waist just to try and keep their vital organs exactly where they should be. Such was the pounding that these guys received on the racetracks. Although I have to say that the restoration on this old Bryan Goss machine has been very well done, and it even has its original Greeves handlebars and controls still fitted from the 1960s, and these bars did take a bit of holding on to on those bumpy British racetracks, but as I said, the guys that raced these bikes during that golden era of scrambling were pretty tough, to say the least, and they didn't let silly trivial things like not being able to hold on to the bars worry them, because they were all of your motorcycle superstars of their day. But as I said, this is a great restoration of an iconic machine that was raced by the legendary racer Bryan Goss, and actually I did learn that just before he passed away, Bryan Goss did try to buy this old race bike back from the current owner, but unfortunately he was unsuccessful. And Bryan Goss was once described as not only a fast and tenacious racer on the track, but a very bright and colourful character off it. And he said that all he ever wanted to do was to have some fun and be everybody's friend. And if you knew Badger personally, then you'll know that those words are entirely true. Now, although I don't have any old pictures of Bryan Goss in action from back in the day, what I do have here is this very short video clip I filmed at the 2020 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, where Badger is being interviewed by the great Jack Burnicle.
He was a hard man, but I managed to get him to let me go up the workshop with him every night. And there was another kiddie next door to me, Tony Chat. We'd go out together with Lou every night and just clean his bike, work on his bike, go off to meetings with him. And my mother said, you are not going grass track riding, so you want to forget that. But anyway, after a little while, about a year, I managed to convince her that, you know, Lou was going to make me a bike, and he did. He made a little bike, a little grass track bike.
And what bike was that then?
Just an ordinary two-stroke called LCS, Lou Coffin Special. And it was on dope, and I'll tell you what, it would go.
What size engine was it?
200, yeah. And he had it on dope, and I convinced me mum, yeah, he did. I convinced me mum that it'll be all right, it's only riding around a grass field, something like that. And I was only about, what, 6 stone and 4 foot, you know, I was no size at all, no weight. And I managed to convince me mum that, you know, it would be all right. So I went with Lou to these meetings, and I started flying on it. I was bloody flying. I went up to Sittingbourne in Kent, and I was mixing with the big boys. And I suppose it must have been about 6 months later, we had a meeting down at Whittendown, Exeter, and it was on a Saturday. Willoughby Hedge on the Sunday, and I was all chuffed down there, and I was keeping up with him at Whittendown, Exeter. And there was a bloke called Eric Congdon on a 500. And I was right there with him. And I thought, I'll have the bugger. And I went out wide, and went out. I hit the fence. God, I hit the fence. I went over the bloody handlebars. And God, did that hurt. That really, really hurt. And there was a crowd come round, and a woman, Red Cross, she was trying to get me boot off. And out the back, I saw Lou Coffin coming. I was frightened to death of him. And he said, out the way, out the way, out the way. He said to the woman, if he broke his leg, she said, I don't think so, he can move his toes. Give him a hot, sweet cup of tea, he'll be all right. That's what he said. Give him a hot, sweet cup of tea. And you know, he picked me up, put me in the back of his, this is true, put me in the back of his Vauxhall. He said, I don't expect you want to go to the hospital. You're like, no, but he don't. So I went home, carried me in, put me out to bed, mother started crying, what have you done to the boy? And do you know what? He said, I'll be down tomorrow morning because it's Willoughby Hedge. Get your boots on, bit of support there, you'll be riding. He come down in the morning, and honestly, it was bloody black and blue. And I was in bed for a week. And the doctor said, I think we ought to go for an x-ray. And I had broken both main bones. I had to have a broken reset. I was out then for like a long time.
Now, it is quite sad to think that just around 4 months after that particular video interview was done, we then lost Badger, who passed away on January the 6th, 2021, aged 80 years of age. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that walk around quite iconic and rare machine from back in the day. That was Bryan Badger Goss's old number 46 Greeves race bike. And if you're of a certain age, like myself, then you may remember Badger and some of the other British stars riding those old machines way back in the day. Now, coming up in my next video posting, we're going to stay with the 2022 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and this is a bike that I spotted during my 2 days of filming. Now, this particular outrageous machine here is a bit of a Heinz 57 variety machine. It's made up from a multiple of different makes and models of motorcycles, and it's powered by one of those 700cc Zabel two-stroke engines. So we'll take a very detailed look at this bike here in my next video posting. But until then, of course, everybody continue to be safe and well out there while you're riding your old vintage race bikes, and we'll all get back here again very soon to talk about more vintage dirt bikes right here on your #1 and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.